Hello, and welcome back to Rough Magic, Shakespeare on Power. We're continuing our discussion of Shakespeare on the exercise of power, and I want to return to a theme that we began the course with, and that is the way in which Shakespeare sees politics as a form of theater. Now, in some ways, this, of course, is an analogy that comes easily to us if we think about big political rallies, for example, as involving a certain kind of stagecraft. Speeches, of course, obviously involve a theatrical element. But what I thought I would do is, in this lecture is to explore a different kind of stagecraft, actually something very similar to what happens in a real play. And I'm going to go back to one of our favorite political figures in Shakespeare, and that's Henry V, and see how he serves as a playwright, as a director, and the leading actor in a small drama just before he goes off to the war with France, which will, of course, culminate in the Battle of Agincourt. If you recall, before he leaves, he has to deal with a treasonous conspiracy by several lords who had actually been quite close to him. And he springs a trap on them. So here's the setup. He says, "Uncle of Exeter, enlarge the man committed yesterday that railed against our person. We consider it was excess of wine that set him on, and on his more advice we pardon him." So he sets himself up to be a nice guy. This is in front of the three conspirators. They give their opinion that this individual who had been denouncing the king should be not forgiven and punished severely. Henry draws this out. He is well aware of the treason. Actually, his loyal advisors are well aware of the treason. He draws this out, and then, of course, he springs the trap. And he says, "If little faults proceeding on distemper," in other words, the guy was drunk, "shall not be winked at, how shall we stretch our eye when capital crimes, chewed, swallowed, and digested, appear before us? The mercy that was quick in us, but late by your own counsel, is suppressed and killed." So he's set himself up to give himself a great opportunity to sentence the three conspirators to death. And he's done it really very elegantly, because what's now happened is they are on record as having urged the harshest possible penalty against this individual, who's obviously done a lot less than they have. They have no real recourse because he has trapped them. And then he turns on one of them, Lord Scroop in particular, and says, "Thus thy fall hath left a kind of blot to mark the full freight man and best endued with some suspicion. I will weep for thee, for this revolt of thine, methinks, is like another fall of man." So what Henry has done in this scene has been to set up the three lords by dragging out the story of this man who had simply denounced Henry when he was drunk. He catches them. He then tells them this is not personal. This is just business. And of course, we all know from The Godfather that whenever somebody says that, actually, it's very personal. And he in particular turns on one of them, Lord Scroop, and compares the betrayal to being like another fall of man. I mean, this is Adam and Eve being driven out of the Garden of Eden. It's a bit of a reach. So what is going on in all this? Shakespeare could have just as easily had Henry simply sentence them all to death. He didn't have to mention this story. But instead, he gives us this scene where Henry has deliberately staged something. So what is it that Henry is up to in all this? Well, if you think about it, by virtue of having arranged this scene so carefully, he's actually achieving a whole bunch of things. First, he is, of course, crushing a treasonous plot. He is showing himself to be both cunning and merciful. After all, he's decided to reprieve the poor drunk who is denouncing him. He is, in a number of ways, tried to make it clear that he does not want to do these harsh things, but he absolutely has to. He has been betrayed by people who are close to him, and so he really makes their offense seem doubly dire. He has also managed to make his pretty ruthless decision to just simply have them executed. Something that seems actually fairly mild. They clearly had it coming at the end of this. And he has set himself up to go off to France with a clean conscience. Because after all, part of the motif of this scene is that God has so graciously brought to light this dangerous treason. So why does Henry have to go through this charade? Well, I think there are a number of things. First, let's bear in mind that the war itself is pretty clearly not particularly legitimate. That has been made clear to us in the early scenes of the play. Henry is very much aware. In fact, there's a scene where before he goes, he offers up these prayers. He knows that his father usurped the throne from Richard II. So he knows that he's vulnerable. He knows that he is in some sense not a legitimate king. So he manages to tidy that up as well. He manages to convince everybody who's left behind that he knows exactly what's going on. They're dealing with somebody very savvy, but they're also not dealing with somebody who's cruel or ruthless. This is somebody who is reluctantly doing what he has to do. It's quite brilliantly done. And this is just a small part of Henry's stagecraft. I'd like to make one other point, which I find very interesting in all this. Sometimes in Shakespeare, we can learn a lot by seeing what are the scenes that frame a particular scene. Well, the scene before this one is back in Eastcheap. It's Bardolph and Pistol and others getting ready to go to war. They're a pretty unromantic lot. They're not tied up in the quest for glory. And in the next scene, we'll actually hear, directly we won't see, but we'll hear Falstaff's death after having been abandoned by the king. And I think Shakespeare may be trying to tell us something in this. And that is that maybe there isn't such a great difference after all between these nobles and the kind of low-born characters like Bardolph. Maybe they're not all that different. Maybe this is the same cunning, calculating king who does not show up at Falstaff's bedside, seems to show absolutely no interest in him. Maybe it's a way of framing Henry's calculation and ruthlessness. And there's a final aspect that I'd like you to think about. Maybe Henry enjoys playing with the conspirators. You know, playwrights sometimes enjoy playing with the audience, playing even with the actors. One has to say there's a little bit of cat and mouse here that makes one think that Henry rather enjoys this. And that's a sobering thought. Well, for next time, and perhaps in the discussion, you can talk about when you've seen some powerful person in politics or business, what have you, in effect, do what Henry has done to write, direct, and even act in their own power play. Next time, we're going to be talking about Coriolanus. And this is Coriolanus, the great Roman hero, after he's won some extraordinary battles. He's up for the election to be consul, and he completely blows it. And we will talk about why. See you next time. Hi, this is Elliot Cohen. Let me welcome you back to Rough Magic, Shakespeare on Power. We've been discussing the exercise of power, and in this session, what I would like to do is to discuss what happens when you have a leader who's pretty much made it to the top, but they are really only good at a narrow range of things. They have a particular kind of capacity, which has taken them very far, but all of a sudden they need to be able to do lots of other things. When I took over as dean, I was fortunate enough to have asked for an executive coach, and she gave me a wonderful book by another coach that said, "What got you here won't get you there." That was the title of the book, and I think of that often. Well, the case that we're going to be looking at here is that of Coriolanus, the great Roman general who's won this terrific victory over the city of Coriolis, hence the name. His original name was Marcius. He wants to be elected consul, so really the foremost figure in Republican Rome. There were 2 consuls elected every year, but the question is whether he will get it. Now, the problem that he faces is that there are these 2 tribunes out there, so these are the representatives of the people. And by and large, Coriolanus despises the people, he despises the plebs, and he despises the tribunes. And the tribunes are wary of him on personal grounds, so it must fall out to him or our authorities for an end. In other words, we stand to lose. But there is a real problem here. We must suggest the people in what hatred he still hath held them, that whose power he would have made them mules, silenced their pleaders, and dispropertied their freedoms, holding them in human action and capacity of no more soul nor fitness for the world than camels in their war. That's not entirely unfair, by the way. That is Coriolanus's view of the people. In this sense, sets up the essential tension in the play, certainly for the first part, before Coriolanus eventually ends up being banished from Rome. Now, one point to be made is that not all of the patricians in this play have that problem. There are other patricians who can deal with the plebs, who in some ways have the same view of the plebs, but they can actually pretty successfully engage them. One of them is Menenius, who's a figure there from the very beginning. He's a bit of an alcoholic, one that loves a cup of hot wine, undiluted by the water of the Tiber, which probably kept him healthier. And interesting what he says, "What I think I utter and spend my malice in my breath." And then he mocks the tribunes. Interesting what Junius Brutus says, isn't it? "Come, sir, come, we know you well enough." They don't view him as a threat. And they don't view most of the other patricians in this play as a threat. Menenius knows how to talk to the tribunes, even when he's not really giving an inch. And actually, he starts by giving this incredible speech to a bunch of starving plebs about why it's okay for the Senate to be doing perfectly well in the midst of a famine, and they don't really try to tear him limb from limb. They know him, he can converse with them, even though it's quite clear to everybody concerned that he is indeed a patrician. As they're getting ready for the great debate about whether or not Coriolanus should be elected consul, there are these two officers who are sort of laying out cushions in the forum for the debate. And the two officers debate. So the one who's listed as the second officer says, "Faith, there have been many great men that have flattered the people who never loved them, and there be many that they have loved, they know not wherefore. So if they love, they know not why, they hate upon no better a ground." Then his basic view is, "For Coriolanus neither to care whether they love or hate him manifests the true knowledge he has in their disposition, and out of his noble carelessness lets them plainly see it." So he's just being kind of straightforward and letting them know what he thinks. But the truth is that there have been plenty of great leaders, he's saying, who have been willing to flatter the people, who have been willing to be more politic, as we might put it. The first officer says, "If he did not care whether he had their love or no, he waved indifferently twixt doing them neither good nor harm. But he seeks their hate with greater devotion than they can render it him, and leaves nothing undone that they may fully discover him their opposite." So he's saying, well, why does he go to such lengths to alienate people? The second officer says, well, look, he's deserved worthily of his country. He's somebody who's very straightforward. He's not one of these people who's kind of slippery and disingenuous. He's going to tell it like it is. And of course, you'll recall that what the people want Coriolanus to do is to show him his wounds. Wounds they all know about, but this is part of the drill, to take off that toga and let them see all the scars. And Coriolanus finds this utterly unacceptable. He finds it dishonorable, ignoble, and he's just not going to do it. He's basically being required to kind of lower himself to their level before they will accept him as a leader. And he, as he says, he'd rather be wounded again than show the wounds. Now, what's also interesting here is, "I will not do it, lest I surcease to honor mine own truth, and by my body's action teach my mind a most inherent baseness." He's determined to honor his own truth. And at one level, you know, that's a ringing phrase. We all like that at some level. And then you realize it's very hard to live that way. I mean, I've known plenty of professors who want to simply honor their own truth. that doesn't necessarily make them very effective in an organizational setting. Coriolanus, of course, ends up refusing to show his wounds. It gets worse, a lot worse from there. He ends up being exiled from the city, and he gives this extraordinary denunciation. You common cry of curs, whose breath I hate as reek of the rotten fens, whose loves I prize as the dead carcasses of unburied men that do corrupt my air, I banish you. I mean, there's a kind of noble madness in this. He's being banished. He's saying, no, I banish you. For you, the city, thus I turn my back. There's a world elsewhere. Again, there's something noble and compelling about it. No doubt about that. There's also something kind of crazy about this. I think we have to admit. And of course, it makes Coriolanus utterly implausible as a political leader. Now, this is not the view of the great political philosophers who've thought about power, about how it should be exercised. And I'll give you the wisest of them, Machiavelli. Since a prince is compelled of necessity to know well how to use the beast, he should pick the fox and the lion, because the lion does not defend itself from snares, and the fox does not defend itself from wolves. So one needs to be a fox to recognize snares, and a lion to frighten the wolves. Those who stay simply with the lion do not understand this. Coriolanus is a lion. He actually compares his great enemy, Ophidius, to a lion that he would like to hunt. He would despise being a fox. But perhaps the nature of power is you have to be, as Machiavelli says, both lion and fox. And again, I'll just speak as a dean. Sometimes you have to be more fox than lion. In fact, most of the time you better be more fox than lion if you want to achieve what you want to achieve. You know, it's easy to say, well, this is Coriolanus, this is Rome, this guy is over the top. But I'm not so sure. We live in an age where a great deal is made of authenticity. And Coriolanus's great claim is that he is authentic. He is who he is. He says what's on his mind. He's a completely straight shooter. There's nothing disingenuous about him. All very true. And all of which make him unfit to exercise power. So think about, what does it mean to show one's wounds? What's that all about? Why do people need to see a leader's wounds, physically or metaphorically? And what are the psychological and spiritual costs? And as always, think about some contemporary analogies. Well, next time, great fun. We're going to talk about witches. Well, actually, the Weird Sisters. People refer to them as witches. We're not sure that they're witches. But they are the Weird Sisters. What's that all about? How does magic play a role in the exercise of power? So think about that, and I'll see you next time. Hi, this is Elliot Cohen, and I want to welcome you back to Rough Magic Shakespeare on Power. This is going to be the last lecture in a series of lectures on the exercise of power. From here, we're going to move to people losing or relinquishing power. But we're ending with my favorite topic, which is magic. I love magic. I love magical kinds of tales. I actually am a not very good amateur magician. So this topic in particular appeals to me. Now, there's a lot of magic in Shakespeare. And I think it is intimately connected with power. One of the points I want to make at the very beginning is power has a kind of magic. I know I've felt that personally. I've been in the Oval Office a number of times. It has a kind of magical aura. By the way, it's a magical aura that frequently prevents people from speaking their mind. I once had a conversation with President Bush's chief of staff who was remarking how many times people would be sitting in his office telling him how they were going to set the president straight on something. They go into the Oval, and that's not quite what they do. And that's very, very common. Power has aura, and it has magic. The second point I want to make is, let us not assume that Shakespeare was superstitious or anything like that, because Shakespeare, although there's a lot of magic and there's witches and all kinds of things in his plays, we should not assume that he's necessarily a believer. And in fact, what we see is actually magic usually doesn't help. So Henry VI, part one, Joan of Arc, summons up a whole bunch of spirits, and she summons them to go beat the British, and they show up on stage, actually, and they let her down. It's not just Joan of Arc. Richard II isn't turning to witches, but he is turning to angels. And there's several times when he's talking about how God is mustering in his clouds on our behalf, armies of pestilence. And although he's correct in anticipating that there will be a great deal of hardship that's going to fall on people, this confidence that he has in the supernatural collapses. What must the king do now? Must he submit? The king shall do it. Must he be deposed? The king shall be contented. Must he lose the name of king? In God's name let it go. Richard, like Joan of Arc, has relied on supernatural forces. They don't come through. Well, of course, Macbeth and Banquo, his friend, who he will subsequently murder, or have murdered, I should say, encounter the three weird sisters, and they don't know what to make of this. Banquo has this wonderful line, "The earth hath bubbles as the water has, and these are of them. Whither are they vanished?" And they are baffled. Banquo even says, "Have we eaten on the insane root that takes the reason prisoner?" Throughout the play, Macbeth and Banquo have their doubts about the three weird sisters, but note those lines at the end. "Your children shall be kings." Banquo, "You shall be king." They know that this may be nuts, but that prophecy, because it promises a great deal to each of them in different ways, sticks with them. And it sticks with them even though they think this may be evil, even though they think this may be being done to deceive them. It gets its hooks into them. And I think that's part of the magic of power, in a way, that it is seductive, and it causes people not to think straight. Does Macbeth really trust the spirits? None of woman born shall harm Macbeth. So then in that case, Macbeth doesn't have a whole lot to worry about, but yet I'll make assurance double sure and take a bond of fate. Thou shalt not live, that I may tell pale-hearted fear it lies, and sleep in spite of thunder. So part of what's so interesting about Macbeth is he knows that he may be making a mistake in trusting the witch's prophecies. So he's going to double down on this and try to kill Macduff. Of course, at the end of the play, it's the other way around. Although he has killed Macduff's family, which makes Macduff actually even more determined to kill him. So part of Macbeth's problem, in a way you could say, is he doesn't trust the weird sisters enough. He decides to kill Duncan, for example. If the weird sisters are right, then this was all going to come into his lap no matter what. So part of the magic of power is it's never completely certain. And it always leaves the person who's feeling its effects uneasy and determined to sort of double down just to make sure. And of course, that's in turn what leads to real calamity. And of course, Macbeth concludes that he was betrayed by the weird sisters, that palter with us in a double sense, that keep the word of promise to our ear and break it to our hope. He's sort of acknowledging here that in the narrow technical sense, they did not lie to him. They told him the truth, but they broke it to his hope. Of course, he doesn't blame himself for that nearly the way that he should. He was tantalized by the magic, but the magic is not no extraordinary power. The weird sisters actually don't really do anything. They conjure up visions and not a lot more than that. They are temptresses, really, even though they are physically hideous. They are tempting him, but it's all actually, at the end of the day, within his own head. And Macbeth, like other figures in Shakespeare, blames them and blames supernatural forces for what are, in the end, their own failings. And here's one of the most famous lines. This is from King Lear, where Gloucester says, "As flies to wanton boys are we to the gods, they kill us for their sport." But if you think about it, in Lear, as in so much of Shakespeare, this is people bringing calamity upon themselves. And they find it hard to accept that, so they turn around and blame the gods. The point that I want to make here is that magic and the magical aura of power is actually dangerous. It deludes people. And I think that is an extremely relevant teaching for us today. The more powerful you are, the less likely you are to hear the truth, the less likely you are to realize the truth about yourself. And that may be why, as the English politician Enoch Powell once put it, all political careers end in failure. You end up believing in your own magic, and that magic ultimately fails you. So, I'm sure you've encountered the magic of power in one sense or another. Why don't you talk about that in the chat? And with our next lecture, we're going to begin the final section of the course, which deals with how people lose power, or how they relinquish it, or how they fritter it away. And the text we'll be looking at is Richard III, Act 4, Scene 2. Just as Richard is made king, he begins doing things which set him up for his final destruction. We'll talk more about that next time.